Gaius Octavius Thurinus, or simply Augustus, born in 63 BC and subsequently referred to as Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, the first emperor of the Roman Empire, governing from 27 BC until his death in AD 14. Following a victory against Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium, he initiated an unprecedented period of peace, termed the Pax Romana, which endured for more than 2 centuries. But that's not all. He also restructured the Roman economy, administration, military and cultural institutions, establishing a standing army with a dedicated police force to uphold peace, repair temples, and advance Roman values via significant architectural endeavors. He then meticulously constructed his persona as the princeps, or first citizen, eschewing monarchical semblance, which facilitated the stabilization of his power and ensured his position as a crucial character in the history of Rome, signifying the conclusive termination of the Republic and paving the way for autocratic control. Hello and welcome. Once more we go back to Roman times, today looking at Augustus, very important emperor. The first. That's got to be counting for something. As always, leave your thoughts in the comments and tell me what you think about Augustus. Maybe you like him, maybe you don't. Or if you're undecided, perhaps you'll find out by the end of the video. Well, that being said, let's begin. Now, before we do so, remember that the name Augustus is kind of like a title. Now, throughout the earlier parts, we're going to be referring to him by his other name, Octavian, which you might also be familiar with. Kind of like referring to him as Augustus, sort of like saying emperor. So let's continue with that in mind. If I mention Octavian, I'm talking about Augustus, the character in question. So, let's talk about where he was born. He was actually born on the Palatine Hill in a nice little palace known as Oxhead, modest estate, quite close to the Roman Forum, and early on in his life he was also given the cognomen Thurinus, which was likely in recognition of a victory his father had over a slave revolt not long after his birth at a place called Thurii. Now, due to the overcrowding in Rome at the time, Octavian was sent to Velletri, his father's ancestral village, for his early upbringing. He briefly mentioned his father's equestrian status in his memoirs, but like we said, just briefly. Now, his paternal great-grandfather served as a military tribune in Sicily during the Second Punic War, while his grandfather held several local political positions. Now, his father, who was also named Octavius, served as the governor of Macedonia. Well, what about on his mother's side? Well, that's an interesting lineage too. You see, Octavian's mother, Atia, was actually the niece of Julius Caesar. Small world. So, around 59 BC, Octavian was just 4 years old, and his father passed away. His mother later remarried one Lucius Marcius Philippus, a former governor of Syria, who claimed descent from Alexander the Great, albeit rather loosely. Well, no one could prove him wrong. Either way, he became consul in 56 BC. Philippus, however, took little interest in the young Octavian, who was subsequently raised by his grandmother Julia, who, once again, small world was Julius Caesar's sister. Well, after Julius' death in 52 or perhaps 51 BC, Octavian delivered her eulogy. Afterwards, his mother and stepfather took a more hands-on role in his upbringing. So, fast forward a little bit. He's now 16 years old, and he had assumed the toga virilis, symbolizing his transition into adulthood, and joined the College of Pontiffs in 47 BC. The next year, he was tasked with overseeing the Greek Games, honoring the temple of Venus Genetrix, which had been built by Julius Caesar in earlier times. Now, we have another source, Nicholas of Damascus, who recounts that Octavian initially wished to accompany Julius Caesar during his campaigns in Africa. But, and I find this quite funny, he couldn't do so because his mother told him he wasn't allowed to. Some things never change, don't they? But later on in 46 BC, she finally relented, allowing him to join Caesar on his campaign in Hispania to confront Pompey's remaining forces. However, Octavian unfortunately got sick. That's right, he fell ill and was delayed, but after he recovered, he made the journey. And despite being shipwrecked, he traversed dangerous enemy territory with a small group of companions, and finally he reached Caesar's camp. Well, when he got there and explained all the things he had to go through, Caesar was apparently deeply impressed. Well, according to Velleius Paterculus, Caesar grew fond of Octavian, allowing him to even ride in his carriage. Upon their return to Rome, Caesar entrusted his will to the Vestal virgins, and he named Octavian as his primary heir. Of course, we all know what happened to Julius Caesar on the Ides of March 44 BC, where they turned him into a block of Swiss cheese. Now at that time, Octavian was in Apollonia, Illyria, engaged in studies and military training. Despite advice from military officers to take refuge in Macedonia, he returned to Italy to try and assess what could be scrounged of his political future. Well, Caesar, having no legitimate heirs under Roman law, had adopted Octavian in his will and named him as his chief heir. Of course, Mark Antony later accused Octavian of using inappropriate means to secure his adoption, but historians like Suetonius dismiss this as political slander aimed at damaging Octavian's reputation. And, well, that kind of was the name of the game at the time. Well, upon reaching Lupiae near Brundisium, Octavian had learned of the details, in all their gruesomeness, of Caesar's demise, but also of his will, and decided to accept his role as Caesar's political heir, inheriting 2/3 of his estate as well, which is certainly not a bad deal. Now, Octavian took on the name Gaius Julius Caesar as part of his adoption. Though Roman naming customs usually retained a person's former name as a cognomen, meaning that Octavian would have added Octavianus, he appears not to have formally adopted this name, and most historians just use Octavian to differentiate him from Julius Caesar before he became Augustus in 27 BC. Well, without substantial personal wealth, Octavian needed resources to establish himself politically. You can't just walk into the Senate with empty pockets. After receiving support from Caesar's soldiers in Brundisium, he requested funds that Caesar had amassed from his campaign against the Parthians. And this was a serious pile of money. It included 700 million sesterces, which were stored at Brundisium. And despite questions from the Senate about the appropriation of these funds, Octavian managed to get away without facing any legal repercussions, as he eventually used the money to build a force to confront Mark Antony, who was the chief opponent of the Senate at the time, ran off to Egypt to enjoy the local flavor. Well, in 44 BC, he also took control of the annual tribute from Rome's Near Eastern provinces without formal approval, which further solidified his financial and political position. Now, Octavian commenced augmenting his personal forces with Caesar's experienced legions and troops allocated for the Parthian campaign, consolidating support by highlighting his position as Caesar's heir. During his advance to Rome through Italy, Octavian's presence and newly obtained resources garnered significant support, particularly from Caesar's former veterans located in Campania. By June, he had assembled an army of 3,000 battle-hardened and devoted veterans, compensating each of them with a bonus of 500 denarii. As we always say on this channel, money talks. Well, upon his arrival in Rome on the 6th of May, 44 BC, Octavian discovered consul Mark Antony, a former associate of Caesar, engaged in a tenuous ceasefire with the assassins of the dictator. On the 17th of March, they were granted a general amnesty. Nevertheless, Antony effectively expelled the majority from Rome with a provocative eulogy at Caesar's funeral, swaying public sentiment against the murderers. I do believe, perhaps it was it? I think it was Marlon Brando in the film Julius Caesar, who gave the speech at the end. Friends, Roman countrymen, lend me your ears, that one. Well, we're not here to talk about that. Back to the real-life Mark Antony, who was consolidating his political power, while Octavian still had the potential to challenge him as the leading figure within the Caesarian faction. You see, Antony had alienated many Romans and supporters of Caesar when he initially opposed deifying Caesar. Furthermore, he withheld the money owed to Octavian as Caesar's rightful heir. This was possibly because he claimed that it needed to be separated from state finances. Well, either way, over the summer, Octavian won the loyalty little by little of many of Caesar's veterans and aligned himself with senators, many of whom had once been staunch supporters of Caesar. But now they viewed Antony as a great threat to the Republic. Efforts by the veterans to mediate between Antony and Octavian completely broke down, and Antony's frankly aggressive stance towards Brutus and Cassius alienated him from more moderate Caesarians in the Senate, who feared the return of a civil war. And with memories fresh in the mind of civil wars of the past, living memory, well, nobody wanted anything like that again. And so, in September, Marcus Tullius Cicero began a series of speeches directly pointing the finger and attacking Mark Antony, portraying him as a danger to the Republic. Well, as Antony's popularity began to wane and his term as consul neared its end, he sought to secure control of Cisalpine Gaul. Meanwhile, Octavian had raised a private army of Caesarian veterans, and on the 28th of November successfully persuaded 2 of Antony's legions to join him with promises of financial rewards. As Octavian's army grew more and more powerful and more skilled, Antony recognized the danger of remaining in Rome and decided to leave for Cisalpine Gaul, a move that relieved the Senate. Antony was set to assume control of the provinces on the 1st of January, but it had already been assigned to Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, one of Julius Caesar's assassins, who refused to yield. In response, Antony laid siege to Decimus Brutus at Mutina, ignoring the Senate's pleas for peace. With no military force at its disposal, the Senate saw their opportunity in Octavian, who had already proven his ability to lead troops. As for Cicero, well, he defended Octavian from Antony's critiques regarding his lack of aristocratic lineage and his use of Caesar's name, portraying Octavian as a symbol of Roman piety and tradition, back to their roots. And of course, when you've got a Senate filled with old men, well, that's certainly one way to sell it to them. Now, thanks to Cicero's influence, the Senate made Octavian a senator on January the 1st, 43 BC, and granted him imperium pro praetore, which officially empowered him to command troops alongside the consuls Hirtius and Pansa in relieving the siege of Mutina. Octavian received the Phasis on January the 7th, a date he later considered the official start of his public career. Antony's forces, on the other hand, were defeated at the Battle of Forum Gallorum on April 14th, and then at Mutina about a week later on April 21st, which forced Antony to retreat back to Transalpine Gaul. However, both consuls were killed in battle, leaving Octavian in sole command of their armies. These victories earned him the honorific title of Imperator, which was a distinction reserved only for victorious commanders. Well, despite Octavian's military success, the Senate awarded more credit to Decimus Brutus and sought to give him control of the consular forces. So, in response, Octavian stayed in the Po Valley and withheld further support against Antony. Fair enough. If they're not going to give him any credit, why bother showing up? In July, Octavian's centurions arrived in Rome, and they demanded that Octavian be granted the vacant consulship left by the deaths of Hirtius and Pansa, and also the repeal of Antony's designation as a public enemy. Well, when the Senate refused, Octavian marched on Rome, and with 8 legions. Well, he faced minimal resistance, and he was elected consul on August 19th, 43 BC, alongside his relative Quintus Pedius as a co-consul. Meanwhile, Antony formed an alliance with Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, another key supporter of Caesar. Now I love this, not being offered the position you want, not getting the job. So after demanding they give it to you, and hearing the wrong answer, you gather all your friends together and just show of force. Eventually, that'll get you the job. Well, that's one way of securing employment. Now, in October, 43 BC, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus met near Bononia to form the Second Triumvirate. Now remember, the first triumvirate was Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey. Go watch the video on that. Now, of course, the Second Triumvirate was a legally recognized coalition that was granted extraordinary powers by the Senate on November 27th for a term of 5 years. Unlike the informal First Triumvirate we've just mentioned between Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus, this new political alliance was formalized through legislation passed by the people themselves. The triumvirs soon launched a series of proscriptions, declaring between 130 and 300 senators and 2,000 equites as outlaws. Well, these proscriptions were partly motivated by the need to raise funds to pay their soldiers for the upcoming confrontation with Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius. The Romans were encouraged to capture the proscribed, with rewards offered for doing so, while the triumvirs seized the properties of the convicted and sold them for quite a pretty penny. Well, of course, ancient historians seem to disagree on which triumvir had the greatest responsibility for these executions and the proscriptions, although all three utilized them to eradicate political adversaries to differing extents. Now, Velleius Paterculus asserts that Octavian sought to refrain from targeting officials, whilst Antony and Lepidus advocated for the proscriptions. Cassius Dio, another historian of the time I'm sure you've heard of, depicts Octavian as more predisposed to preserving life, whereas Antony and Lepidus, possessing stronger political affiliations, confronted a greater number of adversaries. As for Appian, he contends that Octavian was equally implicated as the others. Suetonius suggests that Octavian originally exhibited hesitation, but after a little bit of thought about it, he ultimately engaged his adversaries with even greater ferocity than the other two. Well, either way, January the 1st, 42 BC, the Senate formally deified Julius Caesar, bestowing upon Octavian the title Divi Filius, which means son of the divine. Antony and Octavian subsequently initiated a campaign to vanquish Brutus and Cassius, who had entrenched themselves in Greece. The dual confrontations at Philippi in October 42 BC culminated in the victory of the Caesarian army, leading to the life-takings of Brutus and Cassius, in words that YouTube does not appreciate. Now, Antony leveraged these wins to discredit Octavian, alleging cowardice for entrusting military leadership to Agrippa, while asserting personal credit for the triumphs. Now, after this, the Second Triumvirate reallocated the Roman territory. Octavian, he assumed command of Gaul and Hispania, but Antony had eyes eastward, and he established a very famous alliance, of course, with Cleopatra of Egypt, the former consort of Caesar, and even the mother of his child, Caesarion. Well, Lepidus, he was assigned Africa, but he had to cede Hispania to Octavian. When Octavian confronted the task of securing land in Italy to accommodate the veterans from the Macedonian campaign, a commitment given by the triumvirs, couldn't really back out of that one. A considerable number of these soldiers who had fought for Brutus and Cassius might actually defect from Octavian if their grievances were not addressed. So priorities had to be reorganized. Nevertheless, there was a problem. There was no public land accessible for colonists. Confronted with this dilemma of either estranging Roman civilians by land confiscation or provoking discontent among veterans, Octavian chose to simply appropriate territory. This decision impacted as many as 18 Roman towns, resulting in either complete or partial expulsions of local inhabitants to accommodate the soldiers. Widespread discontent with Octavian regarding the settling of his soldiers prompted many to align with Lucius Antonius, who was actually the brother of Mark Antony, and he also had substantial support from the Senate. Always helps to grease the wheels a little bit. Concurrently, Octavian requested a divorce from his wife Claudia, who was actually the child of Fulvia, Antony's spouse, and her initial husband Publius Claudius Pulcher. He restored Claudia to her mother, asserting that their marriage had never actually been consummated. Fulvia resolved to act. In conjunction with Lucius Antonius, she assembled an army in Italy to advocate for Antony's rights against Octavian. Lucius and Fulvia undertook a political and military risk by challenging Octavian. Given that the Roman army remained reliant on the triumvirs for its remuneration, you can't mess with somebody's salary now, can't you? Lucius and his allies were besieged, albeit defensively, at Perusia, where Octavian compelled their surrender by the early days of 40 BC. Now, Lucius and his forces were actually spared because of his familial connection to Antony, whilst Fulvia, she was exiled to Sicyon. Octavian showed very little compassion, however, for the multitude of allies devoted to Lucius, and on the 15th of March, the anniversary of Caesar's assassination, he slaughtered 300 Roman senators and equestrians for colluding with Lucius. Perusia was similarly ravaged and incinerated as a cautionary example for others. This egregious occurrence certainly tarnished Octavian's reputation and faced criticism from numerous individuals, including the Augustan poet Sextus Propertius. Now, Sextus Pompeius, the progeny of Pompey and a defiant general, had already secured his position quite nicely in Sicily and Sardinia after Julius Caesar's triumph over his father, as stipulated in an accord in 39 BC. Antony and Octavian were competing for an alliance with Pompeius, and in 40 BC, Octavian achieved a temporary alliance by marrying Scribonia, a sister or perhaps a daughter of Lucius Scribonius Libo, who was actually Pompeius's father-in-law. Scribonia delivered Octavian's sole child, Julia. On the same day, he divorced her to wed Livia Drusilla, shortly after their marriage of just over a year. Make up your mind, Octavian. Well, during his time in Egypt, Antony was involved with a very spicy relationship with Cleopatra and fathered 3 children with her. Quite busy. Recognizing the decline of his friendship with Octavian, Antony decided that he would abandon Cleopatra in 40 BC, and he traversed to Italy with a substantial army to confront Octavian besieging Brundisium. Well, this new battle became unsustainable for both Octavian and Antony. You see, their centurions, having attained significant political stature, declined to engage in combat due to their allegiance to the Caesarian cause, prompting the legions under their command to pretty much follow suit and do likewise. At the same time, in Sicyon, Fulvia, the wife of Antony, succumbed to an abrupt illness as Antony was traveling to reunite with her. Fulvia's demise and the insurrection of their centurions enabled the two remaining triumvirs to achieve a kind of reconciliation of sorts. Now, this leads us to the autumn of 40 BC. Octavian and Antony ratified the Treaty of Brundisium, designating Lepidus to remain in Africa, Antony in the east, and Octavian in the west. The Italian peninsula was accessible for the enlistment of soldiers. Nonetheless, the measure proved pretty ineffective for Antony in the east. Now, to solidify the alliance with Antony, Octavian married his sister, Octavia Minor, to Antony in late 40 BC. Now, Sextus Pompeius menaced Octavian in Italy by obstructing grain shipments along the Mediterranean Sea to the peninsula. Of course, if you know anything about Egypt at the time, it was more or less the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. Every day, ships going back and forth along the Mediterranean Sea carrying all the grain. You lose Egypt, you lose the grain. So, Pompeius's son was appointed as the naval commander to instigate a severe famine in Italy. Pompeius's dominance over the sea led him to adopt the title Neptuni Filius, meaning the son of Neptune. Neptune, of course, being the Roman equivalent of the Greek god of the sea, Poseidon. Now, a provisional peace accord was established in 39 BC by the Pact of Misenum. The blockade on Italy was terminated when Octavian conferred upon Pompeius Sardinia, Corsica, Sicily, and the Peloponnese, and assured him a prospective consulship for 35 BC. The territorial accord between the Triumvirate and Sextus Pompeius began to disintegrate following Octavian's divorce from Scribonia and subsequent marriage to Livia on the 17th of January 38 BC. Now, one of Pompeius's naval commanders actually defected and surrendered Corsica and Sardinia to Octavian without even so much of a fight. Well, either way, Octavian didn't really have the resources to challenge Pompeius independently, and an accord was established to extend the Second Triumvirate for a further 5 years, commencing in 37 BC. By supporting Octavian, Antony anticipated securing backing for his own expedition against the Parthians, aiming to revenge Romans' defeat at Carrhae in 53 BC, which was, of course, an embarrassment up there with Cannae and Teutoburg. Not a good day for the Romans, existing in nightmares for quite some time after. Well, in a pact established at Tarentum, Antony allocated 120 ships for Octavian's campaign against Pompeius, while Octavian was to dispatch 20,000 legionaries to Antony for operations against Parthia. Octavian dispatched merely a tenth of what he had promised, which Antony, of course, was not too pleased about. In fact, he perceived it as a deliberate insult, an affront to his authority. And so, in 36, Octavian and Lepidus initiated a collaborative campaign against Sixtus in Sicily. But notwithstanding Octavian's failures, General Agrippa nearly obliterated Sextus Pompeius's naval fleet on the 3rd of September during the naval battle of Naulochus. Sextus retreated eastward with his surviving troops when he was apprehended and murdered by Miletus, one of Antony's generals, the same year. Now, while Lepidus and Octavian accepted the capitulation of Pompeius's forces, Lepidus sought to assert complete and utter domination over Sicily, a zero-sum game, and he instructed Octavian to depart, let him have it all to himself. Thus Lepidus's forces abandoned him and defected to Octavius. Then they were also fatigued from combat. Didn't help Lepidus very much that Octavian was paying more too, so always a deciding factor. Hey, go where you're most valued. Well, Lepidus capitulated to Octavian and was allowed to maintain the position of Pontifex Maximus, but was expelled from the Triumvirate. Well, with his public career all but over, he was virtually exiled to a property near Cape Circe in Italy. The Roman territories were partitioned between Octavian in the west and Antony in the east. Octavian guaranteed the property rights of Rome's residents to preserve peace and stability within his domain of the empire, but on this occasion in particular, he resettled his retired soldiers outside of Italy, and he returned 30,000 slaves to their previous Roman masters. These were slaves who had escaped to join Pompeius's army and navy. I bet that was an awkward way to reunite. Well, Octavian secured tribunal immunity for himself, his wife, and his sister from the Senate to guarantee their protection upon return to Rome. Concurrently, Antony was not having a good time. His war against Parthia proved to be a complete catastrophe, and it also damaged his reputation, and the scant 2,000 legionaries dispatched by Octavian to Antony were insufficient to really make any difference. It was over. Conversely, Cleopatra had the capacity to rejuvenate his military forces, and he was already involved in a romantic liaison with her, prompting him to send Octavia back to Rome. Now, Octavian utilized this to disseminate propaganda, suggesting that Antony was becoming less Roman by forsaking a genuine Roman wife for some Oriental paramour. In 36 BC, Octavian employed a political strategy to portray himself as a less dictatorial option compared to Antony, who was a more villainous one, and he declared the conclusion of the civil wars and offering to relinquish his position as triumvir, provided Antony would do likewise. Spoiler alert, Antony did not do likewise. So, 34 BC, Roman forces seized the kingdom of Armenia, and Antony appointed his son Alexander Helios as its monarch. He conferred the title Queen of Kings upon Cleopatra, actions that Octavian utilized to persuade the Roman Senate that Antony harbored intentions to undermine Rome's supremacy, and it certainly did not take much to convince them of that, especially Queen of Kings. Which kings are you talking about? Oh, do you mean us? Well, we can't have that, can't we? So, January the 1st, 33 BC, Octavian assumed the full consulship once more and commenced the subsequent Senate session with a fervent denunciation. of Antony's allocations of titles and lands to his family and queen. This rift between Antony and Octavian compelled a significant number of senators, along with both consuls of that year, to abandon Rome and actually desert to Antony's side. It wasn't that he was completely out of friends. He didn't have too many of them. Thus, in the autumn of 32 BC, Octavian acquired two significant defectors from Antony, that is, Munatius Plancus and Marcus Titius. The defectors provided Octavian with the facts necessary to substantiate his allegations against Antony before the Senate. So, Octavian forcibly infiltrated the shrine of the Vestal Virgins and confiscated Antony's clandestine testament, which he subsequently disseminated. The will intended to allocate Roman-conquered areas as kingdoms for his sons to govern, and specified Alexandria as the location for a mausoleum for himself and his queen. Well, they did not like that. In late 32 BC, the Senate formally rescinded Antony's consul powers and declared war on Cleopatra's government in Egypt. By early 31 BC, Antony and Cleopatra were briefly located in Greece when Octavian achieved the initial victory. The navy successfully transported men over the Adriatic Sea under Agrippa's leadership. Agrippa severed Antony and Cleopatra's primary military force from their maritime supply lines, while Octavian disembarked on the mainland across from the island of Corcyra, which is present-day Corfu, by the way, and then they advanced southward. There were deserters from Antony's army who were ensnared on land and water, and they defected daily to Octavian's side, while Octavian's men were sufficiently at ease to undertake their preparations. Antony's fleet navigated the Bay of Actium on Greece's western coast in a desperate effort to evade the naval blockade. On the 2nd of September, 31 BC, Antony's fleet confronted the significantly bigger fleet of smaller but more agile vessels commanded by Agrippa and Gaius Sosius during the Battle of Actium. Antony and his remaining troops were salvaged by a desperate intervention from Cleopatra's fleet, which had been stationed nearby. Now, 1 year later, on the 1st of August, 30 BC, Octavian vanquished their forces in Alexandria, subsequent to which Antony and Cleopatra took their own lives. Antony took his own life by falling on his sword, and was transported by his soldiers to Alexandria, where he perished in Cleopatra's arms. Very romantic. And Cleopatra shortly thereafter died from poisoning, contrary to the prevalent idea that she was bitten by an asp, but there's still a lot of argument going on about this. Well, we won't harp on about it now. Octavian had leveraged his status as Caesar's heir to advance his political ambitions, and he saw the risks of permitting another individual to do likewise. Consequently, he heeded the counsel of the Greek philosopher Arius Didymus that 2 Caesars are 1 too many, and then ordered the execution of Caesar's child Caesarion, but preserving the children of Cleopatra from Antony, with the exception of Antony's eldest son. Bad luck for him. Now, Octavian had previously exhibited pretty scant charity towards the defeated adversaries and engaged in actions that were deemed to be frankly, of poor taste by the Roman populace. Nevertheless, he received commendation for absolving numerous opponents following the Battle of Actium. Well, following the defeat of Cleopatra and Antony at Actium, Octavian was poised to govern the entire republic under an unofficial principate. However, he needed to do this through a gradual accumulation of power. He accomplished this by appealing to the Senate and the populace while maintaining the republican traditions of Rome, kind of projecting an image that he was not seeking the monarchy or the dictatorship. Upon entering Rome, Octavian and Agrippa were appointed consuls by the Senate. Now you see, the prolonged civil war that had rendered Rome practically lawless. Yet the Republic was unwilling to acquiesce to Octavian's despotic rule. Simultaneously, Octavian could not relinquish his authority without jeopardizing the potential for additional civil conflicts among the Roman generals, even if he had no aspiration for power. His role necessitated that he prioritize the welfare of Rome and its provinces. And from this, Octavian's objectives were essentially to restore Rome to a condition of utmost stability, as far as that could be pushed, conventional legality and civility, by alleviating the explicit political pressure, at least nominally. Well, on the 13th of January 27 BC, Octavian publicly demonstrated the restoration of complete authority to the Roman Senate and ceded his dominion over the Roman provinces and their military forces. During his consulship, the Senate possessed limited authority to initiate legislation by proposing proposals for senatorial deliberation. You see, Octavian, he no longer exercised direct control over the provinces and their military forces, but he maintained the allegiance of both active duty soldiers and veterans. And, well, if you've got the guys with the weapons on your side, it certainly helps. The careers of several customers and followers relied on his patronage, as his financial influence was unparalleled in the Roman Republic. Now, as consul, Octavian appointed senators as deputies in the provinces to ensure his directives were followed, while regions not under his direct control were managed by Senate-appointed governors. Although he was the leading political figure, he did not monopolize his authority. The Senate retained control over North Africa, Illyria, and Macedonia, with only 5 or 6 legions, compared to Octavian's 20. Of course, this didn't really pose any tangible threat to his power. One can breathe easy. This arrangement preserved the republican appearance of his authoritarian rule, echoing precedents from the republican era. And so, this is where the name change happens. On January 16th, 27 BC, where the Senate granted Octavian the title Augustus, meaning the illustrious one or sublime, which conferred religious authority and suggested a near divine status. This title was strategically chosen over Romulus, which implied kingship, a connection that Octavian wanted to avoid. Now, the Senate also recognized him as Princeps Senatus, evolving into a quasi-regal title for the leader. And of course, the title Augustus became the principal title for subsequent emperors, and this marks the start of his reign as emperor from January 16th, 27 BC. And for the rest of the video, we refer to him by that name, Augustus. I know it took a while, but, we have to provide the context beforehand. So, Augustus referred to himself as Imperator Caesar Divi Filius, which basically means Commander Caesar, son of the deified one. Through this title, he asserted his familial connection to the deified Julius Caesar, while the term imperator indicated a lasting association with the Roman tradition of triumph. And thus he converted Caesar, a surname of a branch of the Julian family, into a novel lineage originating with him. Thus, Augustus was rewarded the privilege to display the corona civica above his entrance and to adorn his doorpost with laurels. Nevertheless, he rejected the ostentation of symbols of authority, including the scepter, golden crown, purple togas of his predecessor Julius Caesar. Didn't want to be too flashy. But despite his refusal to signify his authority by wearing these kinds of things, the Senate conferred upon him a golden shield, exhibited in the curious meeting hall inscribed with the words Virtus, Pietas, Clementia, Justitia, valor, piety, clemency, justice. By 23 BC, the implications of the 27 BC settlement were becoming overwhelmingly clear. Augustus' annual consulate underscored his supremacy in Roman politics, reducing opportunities for others to achieve that highest position. His desire for his nephew, Marcus Claudius Marcellus, to succeed him caused tension with his allies Agrippa, Maecenas, and Livia. After the unexpected death of Aulus Terentius Varro Murena, Augustus appointed Republican Calpurnius Piso as co-consul. In late spring, Augustus fell gravely ill, and, believing that he was near death, took steps to ensure the Principate's continuation while addressing senators' fears of his anti-republican stance. He prepared to pass his signet ring to Agrippa and transferred official documents and military command to Piso, leaving Marcellus empty-handed, which actually surprised quite a few people because they expected him to name a clear heir, but he didn't. In fact, he only allocated properties to his heirs to avoid opposition from Republican-minded Romans who were weary of monarchy. He recognized Marcellus was unprepared for leadership, but intended to signal to the legions that Agrippa was his successor, urging their loyalty to him despite constitutional norms. Shortly after his illness abated, Augustus relinquished his consulship. Augustus would only serve as consul in the years 5 and 2 BC, both instances to facilitate the introduction of his grandsons into public life. Augustus employed a shrewd strategy by relinquishing his role as one of the 2 yearly elected consuls, so enhancing the prospects for aspiring senators to secure their consular position and enabling Augustus to exert greater influence within the senatorial class. Despite reigning as consul, Augustus sought to maintain his consular imperium, not only in his provinces, but over the entire empire. This aspiration, together with the Marcus Primus incident, resulted in a subsequent compromise between him and the Senate, referred to as the Second Settlement. So let's get on to that. You see, it was prompted by several key issues. Firstly, after Augustus abdicated the yearly consulship, he lost his official governing role, but he maintained his prominent status in the Roman provinces as proconsul. While consul, he could intervene in the affairs of provincial proconsuls appointed by the Senate. Now, that Marcus Primus affair, that was a significant issue of its own. You see, in late 24 or perhaps early 23 BC, Marcus Primus, the former proconsul of Macedonia, was charged with waging war against the Odrysian kingdom of Thrace, who was a Roman ally. Of course, he did not have the Senate approval to do this. His defense attorney, Lucius Licinius Varro Murena, claimed that Augustus had given Primus orders to attack the client state. But Primus later stated that these orders came from the deceased Marcellus. Now, if that was true, that would violate the Senate's authority established in the constitutional arrangement of 27 BC. You see, as Macedonia was a senatorial province, and it was not under the direct control of Augustus. I know, it's complicated, right? The situation threatened to expose Augustus' pretense of republican restoration and his role as merely the first citizen. Additionally, Marcellus's involvement suggested Augustus intended for him to succeed as princeps, which once again raised a few eyebrows as it hinted very strongly at monarchy. Augustus attended the trial, despite not even being summoned, acknowledging its importance. Now, when he was there, he testified and he swore that he had given no such command. Murena questioned Augustus's motives for attending, to which Augustus replied that he was simply there for the public's interest. Despite Primus's conviction, some jurors chose acquittal, indicating a kind of skepticism about Augustus's testimony, which was, of course, a slight to his authority. The second settlement aimed to clarify Augustus' legal authority in senatorial provinces. The Senate granted him a general proconsular imperium that covered the entire empire and elevated it to imperium proconsular maius, giving him superior authority over other proconsuls. Augustus stayed in Rome during this process and secured his proconsular imperium maius by 13 BC by generously rewarding veterans. He was granted lifelong authority as tribune, but did not hold the formal title. Previously, he enjoyed the Tribunacia Sacrosanctus, which provided immunity. Of course, where we get the name sacrosanct from. Now, he accepted full magistracy powers, which were traditionally limited to patricians, a status he gained by being adopted by Julius Caesar. Of course, this authority allowed him to summon the Senate and populace, veto decisions, oversee elections, conduct censuses, and determine membership to the Senate. Of course, he exercised this authority by enforcing traditional Roman attire in the forum. There was no precedent for combining tribune and censor roles, and Augustus was never officially a censor. Julius Caesar, well, he had similar powers, but lacked the ability to conduct a census. Augustus revitalized the role of the tribunus plebis by making it necessary for plebeians seeking the praetorship. Now, typically in republican eras, the authority Augustus retained post-second settlement would have been distributed among multiple individuals, each exercising it collaboratively with a partner and for a designated duration. Augustus possessed all powers simultaneously, and without a temporal constraint. Even those powers that ostensibly had time limits were immediately extended upon expiration, so basically the limits were pointless anyway. Now, the political nuances of the second settlement appear to have alluded to the understanding of the plebeian class, who constituted Augustus's primary supporters and clients. This compelled them to demand Augustus's involvement in imperial matters intermittently. In 22 BC, Augustus did not seek election as a consul, prompting further concerns that the aristocratic Senate was attempting to oust him from power. Now, in 22, 21, and 19 BC, the population rioted, permitting the elections of only one consul each year, presumably to reserve the other place for Augustus. Similarly, there was a famine that occurred in Rome around 22 BC, which incited fear as some urban plebeians urged Augustus to assume dictatorial powers to directly manage the problem. Following a dramatic rejection before the Senate, Augustus ultimately assumed the control of Rome's grain supply by virtue of the proconsular imperium, thus resolving the problem. It was not until 8 AD that a food crisis of this nature compelled Augustus to appoint Praefectus Annonae, a permanent prefect responsible for securing food supplies for Rome. You think they would have had that a bit earlier? It seems like an important job. Of course, concerns arose regarding the augmentation of powers conferred upon Augustus by the Second Settlement, culminating in the alleged plot of Fannius Caepio. Before the 1st of September 22 BC, a certain Castricius informed Augustus about a conspiracy orchestrated by Caepio. Murena, the candid consul who advocated for Primus during the Marcus Primus incident, was identified as one of the conspirators. Of course, the conspirators were all tried in absentia, with Tiberius serving as the prosecutor. The jury rendered a guilty verdict, albeit it was not unanimous. All the defendants were condemned to death for treason and executed immediately upon capture, without providing any testimony in their defense. Augustus maintained the appearance of republican governance, while effectively concealing the underlying realities. In 19 BC, the Senate granted Augustus a form of general consular imperium, likely imperium consulare maius, similar to the proconsular authority he received in 23 BC. This, along with his tribune authority, demonstrated his influence from positions he did not officially hold. Of course, Augustus was allowed to don the consul's insignia, sit between them, and carry the fasces, symbolizing the consular authority, and this helped maintain his public image and also authority. On the 6th of March, 12 BC, after Lepidus died, he became the Pontex Maximus, the chief priest of Roman religion. On the 5th of February, 2 BC, he was named Pater Patriae, or Father of the Country. Now, the Second Settlement aimed to ensure constitutional stability for the Principate in case of unforeseen events affecting Augustus, his illness in early 23 BC, and the Caepio conspiracy highlighted the regime's reliance on his life, as frankly his potential death could and most likely would lead to a civil war. You see memories of those past conflicts fresh in the collective subconscious, like Pharsalus and the Ides of March, where they weren't going anywhere. No one wanted to be reminded of those terrible days. To enhance stability, proconsular imperium was granted to Agrippa for 5 years, similar to Augustus's authority, likely covering Augustus' imperial province, but possibly excluding Senate provinces. And this marked the complete consolidation of Augustus's power. You see, by AD 13, he claimed 21 instances of being designated imperator by his army after victories, and his memoirs, Res Gestae, largely focus on military achievements. Now, Augustus in his time promoted the idea of leading a Roman civilization that had a kind of responsibility for governing the world, as reflected in the words of Virgil, Roman, remember to rule the earth's peoples with authority. Kind of like a Roman version, manifest destiny, the Roman man's burden kind of thing. Now, this expansionist sentient was widely supported in Rome and received divine endorsement from Jupiter in the Aeneid, promising imperial sine fine, sovereignty without end. By the end of his reign, Augustus's forces had conquered northern Hispania, modern Spain and Portugal, that is, the alpine regions of Rhaetia and Noricum, Illyricum, Pannonia, and even expanded Africa Proconsularis to the east and south. And then, of course, there was Judea, that was added to Syria after Augustus removed Herod Archelaus, with Syria governed by a high prefect from the equestrian order, rather than a proconsul. Well, to safeguard Rome's eastern provinces from the Parthian Empire, Augustus depended on the client kingdoms of the east to serve as territorial buffers and to generate their own military forces for defense. To secure the empire's eastern border, Augustus deployed a Roman army in Syria, while his adept stepson Tiberius served as Rome's envoy to the east, negotiating with the Parthians. Tiberius facilitated the reinstatement of Tigranes V to the Armenian throne, which I'm sure Tigranes was very pleased about. Good for him. Well, his most significant diplomatic accomplishment was negotiating with Phraates IV of Parthia in 20 BC for the restitution of the battle standards lost by Crassus at the Battle of Carrhae, which served as a symbolic victory and a substantial morale enhancement for Rome. Definitely good to have them back. Now, it wasn't all good news. Of course, the Battle of Teutoburg Forest in AD 9 exemplifies a significant Roman defeat, where the legions commanded by Varus were annihilated by the Germanic leader Arminius, leader of the Cherusci, who was, well, at least they thought, a Roman ally. Augustus responded to this by sending Tiberius and Drusus to the Rhineland to stabilize the region, and they achieved some success. However, it really just, well, the game wasn't worth the candle anymore around the Rhine. It pretty much marked the cessation of the Roman expansion into Germania. Well, excuse me, the Germans are attacking my voice. Well, either way, the Roman general Germanicus exploited a civil conflict among the Cherusci, specifically between Arminius and Segestes, and he triumphed over Arminius at the Battle of Idistaviso in AD 16. Well, Augustus intended for his grandsons, Gaius and Lucius, to be his heirs, adopting them and facilitating their political careers by assuming the consulship in 5 and 2 BC, leading to their nominations for consulships in AD 1 and 4. Of course, he favored his stepsons Drusus and Tiberius, granting them military commands and public office, with a preference for Drusus. After Agrippa's death in 12 BC, Tiberius was instructed to divorce his wife, Vespania Agrippina, and marry Augustus's widowed daughter Julia, after his mourning period, of course. Drusus' marriage to Antonia was seen as a strong bond, while Vipsania was simply Agrippa's daughter from his first marriage. Now, Tiberius possessed Augustus's tribune powers starting in 6 BC, but soon thereafter retired, allegedly seeking to disengage from politics while exiling himself to Rhodes. The exact reason for his departure remains a little bit mysterious, though it may seem from a confluence of factors, including deteriorating marriage with Julia and feelings of jealousy and alienation regarding Augustus's apparent preference for the younger Gaius and Lucius. Well, either way, Gaius and Lucius had entered the priesthood at a very young age, and they were showcased to the public quite positively, subsequently introduced to the military as well in Gaul. Well, the only other heir was Agrippa, posthumous, exiled by Augustus in AD 7 and permanently disavowed. In fact, he's been described as a vulgar and brutish man of depraved character, which is definitely a 1-star review. Well, Augustus died on the 19th of August AD 14 in Nola, where both Tacitus and Cassius Dio reported rumors that Livia poisoned him with figs, of all things. Well, some historians view this as more of a fabrication by the supporters of Postumus or Tiberius as political rivals. Livia had been rumored to poison for her son, but these claims are most likely false. It is possible that she provided a poisoned fig as more of a push out the door for him, rather than murder, a bit of mercy to end his suffering. Either way, we do know that Augustus's health had declined before his death, and he prepared for a smooth power transfer, naming Tiberius, albeit quite reluctantly, as his successor. Although he seemed to improve upon arriving in Nola, it is speculated that, well, Augustus and Livia may have conspired to end his life at the right moment, as a favor to Tiberius of all people, to ensure his acceptance of power. Well, either way, a large procession of mourners escorted the body of Augustus from Nola back to Rome, and all large public and private activities halted on the day of his burial. Tiberius and his son Drusus delivered the eulogy on 2 platforms. Augustus's bones were placed in a coffin and cremated on a pyre next to his monument. Of course, he was also proclaimed a member of the Roman pantheon, aligning himself up there with the deities forever. And that's it, the end of the life of Augustus / Octavian. I hope you enjoyed that. And let me read now from my list of supporters. There's Dark, Kerry, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Erin, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Sherry, Jessica, Christine, Sally, Katiana, Christine, Fizabo, Legitmus, and Maverick. I always like reading out Legitmus's name. It just sounds very Roman. All right. Well, thank you very much for listening. And I will see you, hopefully tomorrow, if you choose to return. Good night. Lots of love to you all.